The descent into darkness, how pleasure turns into pain. The path to mixing pain with pleasure is often subtle and insidious, beginning with the most human of desires, the pursuit of joy, satisfaction, and happiness. But when this pursuit becomes unbalanced, when pleasure is sought without restraint or respect for the natural limits of the good, it can lead to a dangerous and destructive spiral. The exhaustion of pleasure. It starts innocently enough. You seek out pleasure in the ways that are familiar and satisfying: food, relationships, achievements, and the simple joys of life. But as you indulge more and more, the initial thrill begins to fade. The pleasures that once brought you so much joy now feel dull, repetitive, and unsatisfying. The emotional response to these experiences weakens, and what was once vibrant becomes mundane. Overindulgence dulls your senses. The brain, accustomed to the constant stimulation, begins to crave something more, something different. This is where the temptation arises, the whisper in the back of your mind suggesting that perhaps you need to add a little something extra to reignite that lost spark. This is where the seed of mixing pain with pleasure is planted. The temptation of pain as a stimulus. In this moment of diminished pleasure, the idea of introducing pain enters the picture. Pain in its raw form is a powerful stimulus. It shocks the system, it wakes up the dulled senses, and when combined with pleasure, it creates a new, heightened sensation. It's like adding a new color to your emotional palette. Suddenly, you are not just seeing in the familiar spectrum, you are seeing in ultraviolet. This broadening of sensation is intoxicating. By adding pain to pleasure, you feel alive again. The intensity returns, the emotional flatness is gone, and once more you are able to feel deeply. But this new mix is also dangerous because it opens the door to addiction. The moment you cross that boundary, when you start to indulge in the forbidden combination of pleasure and pain, you begin a descent that is hard to reverse. The shift in values and perception. As you continue to indulge in this new, amplified pleasure, something fundamental begins to change within you. The principles that once guided your life, those that valued the sanctity of life, the integrity of the good, and the purity of pleasure, begin to erode. Subconsciously, your value system shifts. The good that once held priority in your life loses its place, and evil, the pursuit of pleasure at any cost, starts to take root. This shift is subtle at first. You might not even notice it happening. You justify your actions, telling yourself that it's just a way to feel more, to experience life more fully. But each time you sacrifice the good for this superficial high, you reinforce the new pattern. Your brain begins to associate this mix of pleasure and pain with something positive, confusing it with what is truly good. The acceptance of a destructive mechanism. Worst of all, you begin to accept this mechanism. Without realizing it, you start to believe that sacrificing the good to amplify pleasure is not only acceptable, but necessary. This belief takes hold on a subconscious level, guiding your actions and decisions without your conscious awareness. If you are not extremely self-aware, if you do not have the knowledge to understand what is happening on a neurological level, you become a victim of this process. You fall down the rabbit hole, and it's a long way down. The deeper you go, the harder it is to see the way out. Your subconscious is already programmed to seek out this destructive mix. And without a deep understanding of the science behind it, you wouldn't even understand what's happening to you. You would need a profound awareness, perhaps even a medical or neurological education, to recognize the trap you've fallen into. But for many, this understanding never comes. They continue down this path, fulfilling what seems like a predetermined destiny, descending further into a hell of their own making, one where the pursuit of superficial pleasure leads to the sacrifice of the highest principles. The false criteria of good and evil. In this state, your criteria for good and evil become warped. What feels good in the moment, what stimulates the senses, what satisfies the craving, becomes your new standard for what is good. But this is a false measure. Sacrificing the sanctity of life, the integrity of your principles, for a superficial high, this is not true goodness. It is a betrayal of everything that is sacred. You may tell yourself that it feels good, that it must be right because it brings you pleasure. But this is a deception, a distortion of reality. The true good is not found in the fleeting highs of mixed pleasure and pain. It is found in the preservation of life, in the respect for the natural boundaries that guide us toward what is truly fulfilling. Conclusion: the journey from pure pleasure to the destructive mix of pain and pleasure is a perilous one. It begins with the exhaustion of the good, with the overindulgence that dulls your senses and leaves you craving something more. The temptation to add pain as a stimulus opens up a new, unnatural spectrum of sensation, one that feels powerful but is ultimately destructive. As you descend into this cycle, your values shift, your perception of good and evil becomes confused, and you begin to accept a mechanism that sacrifices the highest principles for superficial pleasure. This is the danger of mixing pain with pleasure. It leads you away from truth, away from what is genuinely good, and into a state where your subconscious guides you down a path of destruction. In the end, the sacrifice of good for a superficial high is not just a moral failing, it is a profound distortion of reality. It is a journey into darkness, where what once was clear becomes clouded, and where true pleasure and fulfillment are lost in the pursuit of something that feels good but is far from good. This is not the path to happiness, it is the path to ruin, and the sooner you recognize it, the sooner you can turn back and find the true good that you were meant to pursue.